Alrighty, folks, want to welcome you back to another video from Yates Computers Tips and Reviews. I know everybody's covered this subject to death, and there's technology out every week, complaints about this, complaints about everything, is your GPU. Maybe a lot of people don't understand what that term is, but that is your graphics card. I wanted to do a short little video. I know it's the rabbit hole year, and this can be really kind of a big subject or a big pain in the rear. I would kind of call it, manage it that way. If you're a basic home user and you're doing basic stuff, most likely your computer has a video card on it that would most likely do most of what you need it to do. If you're a gamer or a graphic designer or something of that sort, you may want to upgrade your video card and add it in there. Nowadays, they're doing a lot with CPUs that are supposed to support graphics and GPU stuff in a CPU. Honestly, I have not looked into a whole lot of that, but I wanted to go through and explain some of that so people are aware of it, because I'm sure you're going to hear it. You're going to possibly see it in some computers. Because of Windows 10 going away, support stopping, and Windows 11 out, Windows 12 is coming around the corner. Unless this last situations of everybody raising red flags and stuff that might get postponed, but it's coming around the corner. So, wanted to go through and do a short little video on video cards, on your GPU, understanding that there is more than one manufacturer. You have Intel, who entered the game. You have NVIDIA, and you have AMD. I've done videos on the color wars because one's blue, one's green, and one's red. That is my color war videos to let people know what is going on. That is the colors of the company that they represent. That's the colors that they show. So I just call it the color wars because that's what it is. It's these companies battling over these video cards and what performs best and what games works best, and a lot of it's gaming. But if you're in the business where you're going to need these things, some of this stuff does come into factors into play. Did a video on CPU. Did a video on motherboards, did a video on cases, did a video on cooling. All of these kind of apply to that card that you add on. This year is kind of a weird year for me because I've mentioned this in pretty much all the videos in the last little while, that now you kind of officially do not need a SATA drive. That makes cases different, it makes motherboards different, it makes wire management different, it makes a lot of things different because now you don't have all this in here. And that might get you into an issue where you buy a video card that's pretty large that doesn't fit because of water cooling or whatever else you have in there, because they took all this out and they made the case smaller and you didn't realize that. Have a few computers where the case is actually smaller. Mention on that video that it's not necessarily a bad thing, because it's an air-cooled computer. It's not going to hold a 4090 or anything like that because the power supply is not spec'd for it. None of that stuff is designed for that. It's probably never ever going to need that for what the use is going to be. So it's perfectly fine. But it's one of those things to be cautious and careful of when you buy a case, to make sure. What's the dimensions? How much space you got in there? Now, with cooling, I told in the cooling video, it's kind of nice because if you get this size of a case and you don't have all this in here, and you have cooling up top, and you can mount that card in there, you can see some cases, it gets a little tight towards the front. Some of the new cases have the spot in the radiator up front. Well, I believe those cases are a little bit smaller because you don't need all of this, but you can get the right measurements and understand what size your case is. In the case video, I talked about clear panels and clear cases and stuff that you can see in. There's all kinds of things out there to know. If you want to show off that video card, you want that thing to be certain color and all of that type of stuff. So I wanted to cover that in the video card area. It's going to be pretty short probably because there's not a lot of relevant information. It's just because of the rabbit hole year that I'm doing, this could be a rabbit hole subject. Because you can always buy a better motherboard with a better video card integrated. You can buy an older generation video card, or you can buy a modern generation video card, or you can buy an old video card. Because you can get a 3090 or a 4090, or you can get like a 1060 card or something of that sort that's an older generation that would probably work for most of your practical needs. If you're a gamer, you're probably going for the newest, modern, and bigger and badder. Depending on if you built that computer or you bought that computer, depending on what CPU, what memory, and all this other stuff that's involved. And the biggie, what power supply you got in there. Because that's really going to be the main factor. If your power supply can't support the video card, well, it ain't going nowhere with it. So, those were some of the factors. Again, now, mentioned on the motherboard, the buses and the channels to the ports and CPU are an important factor. Because now you're also dealing with the NVMe on the board that supports channels and buses to communicate to the CPU. So these are some of those little factors I just wanted to point out because it's mentioned in the other videos, but this is going to be a cause and effect for you for your graphics card, your GPU. Understanding that, because you might get into a point where you get a little awkward and you get into a spot where you can't quite figure out, is this proper or not proper? Should I use this or should I use that? Talked about the memory on the CPU. Might be one of the factors when, depending on what graphics card you buy. If you go out and buy a 4090, odds are you're going to be buying an i9 like Extreme Edition that you can overclock and do other things with. But depending on what other versions are out there, what kind of memory, what kind of speed that CPU is, how many cores that CPU is, all of those factors come into play with that graphics card. Knowing those little factors, because you don't want to be bottlenecked in your graphics card or your memory speed, DDR4, DDR5, with your graphics card. 3rd gen, 4th gen NVMe might come into effect. Probably will come into effect. Knowing the difference, knowing what you got, are the factors that why I brought this up for video card. Air cool, water cooling, I've talked about. making sure you have the fans in there, making sure you have all your circulation, making sure you have all of that stuff. One thing I didn't mention on air cooling and water cooling, cleaning your case out, making sure you don't have all the dust balls and the hair balls growing in there because it hasn't been cleaned out in years. Because that could block your airflow, not to mention block your fans, block the air circulation in the fans, block the radiator vent. A lot of different factors. So, wanted to do a little short video just on that. Again, then you have another factor of it, what ports that video card actually has, how many monitors it supports, HDMI, DisplayPort, VGA, DVI, whatever it is. Because depending on the situation you have, doubt you're going to be going out buying hopefully you're not going out buying a 4090 video card, downgrading it to DVI because you have a DVI monitor. Of course, you're going to have the higher end monitors and the higher end things to go with that video card to support it. I know that's not a subject I've talked about. I know that's not a subject that I think a lot of people have really pointed out, because they're assuming if you bought a new modern video card with an HDMI out, you're running it to a monitor with HDMI. Depending on the environment, depending on what it is, if it's an integrated video card and you have an old monitor and you downgrade it, hopefully you're not going down to from digital to an analog monitor. Hopefully you're staying with digital to digital, DVI, HDMI, DisplayPort, something along that line, and not going down too far, because that kind of defeats the purpose. But if you bought a brand new computer and you're happy with that kind of monitor and you're happy with that kind of resolution, you could. But don't go out and buy a big expensive video card to downgrade it. I've seen that a lot, that people go, well, I wanted something really good, so I bought this. Okay, but why are you storing? Oh, I didn't want to pay the $300 for a new monitor. Well, you added $400 or $500 to your computer to get the better video card, but you don't want to pay the $300 for a monitor. So that's kind of the catch-22. Of course, that's the rabbit hole effect. This connected to that, connected to that, connected to that. You don't want to put in a Celeron on a 4090. You don't want to put in an i3 on a 4090. Yeah, it might work for a lot of good applications, a lot of things that maybe you're okay with, but there's no reason to spend that kind of money for that. Of course you could. Of course it would work. I'm sure it would suit most things you want to do. But it's not going to be to the maximum performance. Don't know if any manufacturers would even really do that. Don't know if they would even have the options for you to do that. But I'm sure if you got a custom built or you built it yourself, you probably could. But just wanted to go through some of those little factors, because it's not something I hear a lot of people mentioning. I hear a lot of benchmarking and a lot of other things with it. But to me, I thought, boy, that's kind of like a huge rabbit hole subject, because really, if you do something wrong in that chain, you're really just bottlenecking it. You're hurting yourself. to understand that all these things are connected and how that performance would be affected by one of these things might lead you to change CPU, motherboard, case, power supply. A lot of these factors are out there that are due to the video card. Of course, having the proper wattage is going to be number one. Making sure you have the right CPU. The new variable out there, DDR4, DDR5. I don't know how much that would actually affect your video card. Having everything coming off the motherboard off of a M.2 NVMe, version 3, version 4. Version 5, I believe, is official. But nothing is, I think there's one out there as of now, but people are kind of dismissing it because there's nothing that can really support that kind of channels and speeds, and that's probably going to be a whole new CPU. That's probably going to be a whole new architecture of a board. A lot of other things for the buses, channels, and everything else to really take advantage of that. That would probably have a change on that graphics card. It's kind of a funny thing because there's nothing you did to that graphics card itself. It's everything else that had that effect on that graphics card. So that was kind of like the rabbit, that's what drew the rabbit hole up. Because it's not really you doing your research on that video card, whatever's integrated on that motherboard. That's a whole nother thing too. That one that's integrated on that motherboard is usually shared memory that's on your board. Now, DDR4, DDR5, you think that would possibly have an effect on an integrated video card? Yeah, I'm imagining that would probably have a huge effect. The speeds and the bandwidth. How much memory you actually have on that motherboard, I'm sure probably would have a major effect. Single channel, dual channel, I'm sure probably has a major effect. Because again, that graphics card that's on that motherboard is using the resources on the motherboard. CPU. I'm sure that would have an effect. Goes back to what I talked about, the memory on the CPU, the cache. I'm sure it would have an effect on that video card that's integrated because it's using those resources. And that video card usually uses a percentage of the resources. So if it's using 5 or 10%, and you get the lowest number to compare to the higher number, it's going to have a difference. So that was one of those little factors I wanted to point out. Just in graphics, the onboard graphics also. Those are some of those little factors. Having that M.2, 3rd gen, 4th gen, 5th gen, having a SATA, having a spinning mechanical, all those load times, all the latency, all of those factors are going to have effect on gaming and everything else. So it's kind of interesting, and I want to see where this actually goes here within the next few years. Is these onboard graphics cards, where everything goes, because now you're drawing off of some things that are pretty fast. The technology's there that it's just, whoo, it's pretty quick. So, kind of curious to see, and I'd love to see some benchmarks and ratings on onboard video cards between DDR4, DDR5, and all of these other type of factors. It's kind of an interesting subject now. And this is what I thought was interesting with this rabbit hole. Really now, a new modern DDR5 with an onboard NVMe Gen 4 on the motherboard graphics card, or even a CPU with graphics in it that would help support the graphics card. I'm not too sure where the variances are, or just say a standard CPU compared to a 1080 video card, compared to some of the older generations, an 8th gen, 6th gen, 2nd gen CPU onboard video card. Be interesting to see how the technology and all of that has moved up, because obviously they've gone from analog to digital, from the ports changing from HDMI to display, all the different display types, mini display, all these other different things that they've had. 1080, 4K, 8K resolution, all of these things that have come up have obviously come up on these boards. So if you got a 10-year-old computer, I'm sure those graphics are going to be a lot better on a newer computer on an onboard graphics card than they are on that old one. So that's kind of the rabbit hole that I had with graphics cards. Because I know a lot of people, all they talk about is those new fancy ones that are inserted and all of that stuff. Especially with, again, this is the Windows 11, Windows 12 environment. Now, SATA drives are not really needed. You have the M.2 NVMe drive that's on the board. Kind of changed a little bit of this. That I wanted to bring this out because this is not the same as it was 20 years ago now. A lot of this tech has moved so far in advance and jumped up that this is why it's the rabbit hole. And this is something you probably want to keep an eye on in the next couple of years. Because I'm sure a new modern computer with the onboard video card is probably more than enough for most people. Unless you're doing some high-end gaming. Or some high-end graphics or something of that sort. So again, I want to thank everybody for watching Yates Computers Tips and Reviews. I want to wrap this one up on your video card GPU. And I wanted to cover internal and onboard. Not just the internal card you put in, but the onboard card. Alrighty, thank you. Make sure you hit the subscribe.